What would you do if a stranger left you everything? And the price of keeping it was uncovering a truth that had been buried for half a century. Elliot Marsh was 38 years old and 3 weeks away from losing his apartment when the letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, handwritten in the kind of careful cursive that nobody under 60 uses anymore. His name and address were spelled out perfectly, which struck him as odd because almost nobody knew his new address. He'd only moved to the basement unit on Garfield Street in Sudbury after the divorce, after the job, after everything had come apart in the span of about 4 months. He almost threw it away. He'd been throwing away a lot of letters lately, mostly from creditors, and he'd developed a habit of not opening anything that didn't look like a check. But something about the handwriting stopped him. He stood in the narrow hallway of his apartment, the one that smelled like someone else's cooking, no matter what time of day it was. And he opened the envelope with his thumb. Inside was a single page, and a business card for a law firm in Haileybury. "Dear Mr. Marsh," it read, "that you have been named the sole beneficiary of the estate of one Constance Bellaire, who passed away on the 14th of October. The estate includes a property of approximately 52 acres located outside Cobalt, Ontario, along with its structures and contents. We ask that you contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the terms of the bequest." Elliot read it twice, then a third time. He had never heard the name Constance Bellaire in his life. The law office of Hartwell & Doyle was on the 2nd floor of a brick building on the main street of Haileybury, wedged between a dental clinic and a store that sold hunting supplies. Elliot drove up from Sudbury on a Thursday morning in November, the highway slick with the first real freeze of the season, the sky the color of old pewter. Northern Ontario in November is not a place that forgives you for being unprepared, and Elliot had not been prepared for much of anything lately. Graham Doyle, 64, met him at the door himself. He was a compact man with wire-rimmed glasses and the measured, unhurried manner of someone who had spent 40 years delivering news, both good and bad, and had learned not to telegraph which kind was coming. "Mr. Marsh," he said, shaking Elliot's hand. "Thank you for making the drive. Please come in." The office was warm and smelled of coffee and old paper. Graham gestured to a chair across from his desk and settled into his own with the careful movements of a man whose knees had given him trouble for years. "I'll be direct with you," Graham said, folding his hands on the desk. "I imagine you have questions." "Just one, really," Elliot said. "Who was Constance Bellaire?" Graham nodded slowly, as if he'd expected exactly that. Constance was 81 years old. She'd lived on the Bellaire property outside Cobalt for most of her adult life. She had no children, no surviving siblings, no immediate family that we were able to locate. He paused. "She left very specific instructions about the estate. And she named you." "I've never met her," Elliot said. "I don't. That name means nothing to me." "Are you sure there isn't a mistake?" "There is no mistake," Graham said. He opened a folder on his desk and slid a document across to Elliot. "She amended the will 18 months ago. Your name, your date of birth, your social insurance number." Constance was very at the page. His own information, printed in neat type, in a document signed by a woman he had never met. "There's a condition," Graham said. Elliot looked up. "The property cannot be sold for 1 year from the date of transfer." Constance's instructions were that the heir must spend at least 30 consecutive days on the property before any decisions about the estate are made. After that period, the estate is yours to do with as you choose. If you decline the inheritance or fail to meet the 30-day condition, the property transfers to a land trust. Elliot sat back in his chair. He thought about the apartment on Garfield Street, the eviction notice he hadn't opened, the last text from his sister, asking if he was okay, to which he had not responded. "What's the property worth?" he asked. Graham removed his glasses and cleaned them on his sleeve, a small deliberate gesture, as if buying a moment. The land alone, in the current market, would appraise somewhere between $400,000 and $450,000. The structures need work. But the land is valuable. Elliot said nothing for a long moment. "Where do I sign?" he said. He drove out to the property on a Friday afternoon when the light was already going thin and low. Graham had given him a key, an actual iron key, heavy and old, and directions written on a notepad because GPS, he warned, would lose the signal about 2 kilometers before the turnoff. Graham was right. The road into the property was unpaved, rutted from the freeze and thaw cycles of a dozen Ontario winters, lined on both sides with birch and spruce that closed in overhead like a corridor. Elliot's car bottomed out twice before he reached the clearing, and then he saw it. The farmhouse sat at the center of what had once been a working property. He could see the ghost of it, the old fence lines, the collapsed remains of what might have been a greenhouse, the dark shape of a barn off to the north. The house itself was 2 stories, built from the kind of pale fieldstone you find all over this part of Ontario, with a covered porch that sagged on one end and windows that caught the last of the afternoon light and gave nothing back. It was not welcoming, but it was not frightening either. It was simply old and waiting, in the way that very old things sometimes wait. Elliot got out of the car and stood in the cold for a moment, his breath fogging in the November air. He could hear nothing but wind in the spruce, and somewhere, far off, the call of a bird he couldn't identify. He thought, What did you want me to find here, Constance?" No answer came. He picked up his bag from the back seat and walked toward the door. The inside of the house was cold but dry, which was more than he'd expected. Someone had winterized it recently. The pipes hadn't frozen, and there was wood stacked beside the cast-iron stove in the kitchen, and a note on the counter in the same careful cursive as the envelope. "The flue needs to be opened before you light it. The well pump is primed. The back bedroom on the 2nd floor is the warmest. CB." He stood in the kitchen for a long time, reading that note. She had known he was coming. She had prepared for him. She had stacked wood for a man she had never met. Why? He lit the stove, careful with the flue, as instructed, and ate the gas station sandwich he'd bought in Haileybury and tried to think. His phone had 1 bar of signal, enough to confirm there were no messages he wanted to answer, and then he set it on the counter and listened to the house. Old houses in northern Ontario talk. They expand and contract with the cold. They settle. They have opinions about the wind. Elliot had grown up in a house like this, outside of New Liskeard, before his family had moved south, and everything had gotten quieter and more manageable and somehow worse. He had not thought about that house in years. He slept better than he had in months. In the morning he explored. The ground floor was a kitchen, a sitting room, a small study whose bookshelves were still full, and a room at the back that had been used as a sewing room, and then, more recently, as a kind of storage space for things that had no clear category. Old photographs in cardboard boxes, a wooden crate of glass jars, a canvas bag of what turned out to be seed packets with handwritten labels, a rolled-up map of the property that Elliot spread out on the kitchen table and studied for a long time. The 2nd floor had 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. The back bedroom, as Constance had noted, was the warmest. It was also clearly the room she had slept in. The quilt on the bed was worn smooth with use, and on the nightstand there was a glass of water that had evaporated down to a white ring, and a book with a library card tucked inside as a bookmark, and a small framed photograph. Elliot picked up the photograph. It showed 2 young women, maybe 19 or 20, standing in front of what he recognized, from the map, as the barn. They were laughing at something off camera. One of them he couldn't identify. The other one, something about the way she held herself, the particular angle of her chin, gave him a feeling he couldn't quite name. He set the photograph down and went to look at the barn. The barn was in better condition than it looked from the outside. The roof had been patched. The floor was solid, and along the north wall there were rows of old wooden shelves holding mason jars, labeled in the same handwriting as the seed packets, full of things Elliot couldn't always identify. Dried herbs, preserves. Something that looked like maple sugar in various stages of crystallization. He was examining one of the jars when he heard the footsteps behind him. He turned. An old man stood in the barn doorway. 70, perhaps, or older, with the weathered face of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors and the stillness of someone who was not surprised to find a stranger in this barn. "You must be the one she sent for," the old man said. It was not quite a question. "I'm Elliot Marsh," Elliot said. "I inherited the property." The old man nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he'd already been told. "Theodore Polk," he said. He didn't offer his hand. "I've worked this land for 30 years. Constance kept me on to look after things. The lawyer didn't mention you." "No," Theodore said. He wouldn't have. He looked around the barn with the unsentimental gaze of a man assessing inventory. "I'll stay out of your way. I've got a place at the edge of the north field. But there are things on this property you'll want someone to explain. Starting with why she left it to me," Elliot said. Theodore looked at him for a long moment. "That," he said carefully, "I can't tell you. That's not mine to tell." And then he turned and walked back out into the cold morning and disappeared into the tree line. And Elliot stood in the barn alone, with the rows of labeled jars and the feeling that he had just walked into the middle of a story that had been running for a very long time before he arrived. The first strange thing happened on the fourth night. Elliot had settled into something like a routine. Mornings exploring the property, afternoons reading through the books and papers in the study, evenings by the stove eating whatever he'd driven into Cobalt to buy. He had stopped checking his phone with any urgency. The creditors would wait. The apartment would be lost or it wouldn't. Out here, those problems had the quality of things happening in another country. On the fourth night, he woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of movement below. Not the sounds the house made on its own. He'd catalogued those in the first 2 nights, memorized their rhythms. This was something else. Careful footsteps, crossing the kitchen floor, pausing, moving again. He lay still, listening, his heart doing something unpleasant in his chest. Then the footsteps stopped. A long silence, and then the sound of the back door closing, very softly, the way you close a door when you don't want anyone to know you've been there. Elliot got up and went downstairs. The kitchen was empty. The back door was locked from the inside, which meant whoever it was had a key. On the kitchen table, and this was what stopped him, what he stood and stared at for a full minute, was a small object he had never seen before. A brass compass, old, with a cracked lens and a piece of twine tied through the ring at the top. And underneath it, a folded piece of paper. He opened it. "What you're looking for isn't there. Leave this alone and I'll make sure. You get a fair price for the land. $250,000. Clean. No conditions. No questions. No signature." A phone numbers with a 705 area code. Elliot set the note down. He stood in the cold kitchen, in the house of a woman he'd never met, and he thought about $250,000. He thought about the eviction notice. He thought about what fresh air and a clear slate could do for a man who had been running on empty for the better part of a year. Then he picked up the brass compass and turned it over in his hands. On the back, scratched into the metal in small letters, "For when you need to find your way back. VV, not CB, not Constance." He put the compass in his pocket and went back upstairs. In the morning, he found Theodore in the north field, checking the fence line. "Someone was in the house last night," Elliot said without preamble. Theodore didn't look up from the fence post he was examining. What did they want? They left an offer, $250,000 for the land, and they told me to stop looking in the barn. Now Theodore looked up. Not surprise exactly, but confirmation, the expression of a man whose worst suspicion had just been verified. He set down the fence tool in his hand. "How much do you know about Constance?" he asked. "Almost nothing," Elliot said. "That's the problem." Theodore came across the field and bent the dried grass and moved on. "She wasn't from here originally," Theodore said. "She came up from the south, from the Niagara region in 1987. Bought this property with her own money. Cash. Nobody up here knew her, but she didn't seem to need to be known. She was—" he paused, searching for the right word. "She was contained, private, but fair. She never cheated anyone. She never asked for more than she gave. Who's V? Elliot asked. Theodore went very still. Where did you see that name? He said, and his voice had changed. Elliot took the compass out of his pocket and held it out. Theodore looked at it without taking his eyes, an old man who had learned over decades to keep his face still. Something shifted, moved, cracked open just slightly. Victoria, he said, quietly, like a word he hadn't said in a long time and wasn't sure his mouth still knew the shape of. Who was Victoria? Theodore picked up his fence tool again and turned back to the post. I think, he said slowly, that you need to look more carefully at the study, not at the books, at the desk. The desk in the study was a solid old thing. Oak, Elliot thought, or maybe maple, built to last, with a row of drawers down the right side and a large central drawer across the top. And found the usual detritus of an old person's administrative life. Stamps, rubber bands, a checkbook from 1998, a roll of tape. He pulled out every drawer this time and examined them properly. In the bottom right drawer, beneath a folded Ontario road map that was 30 years out of date, he found a false bottom. It wasn't sophisticated, a thin piece of plywood cut to fit, with a small notch routed out at one corner as a finger hold. He lifted it. Underneath was a letter, and a photograph, and a folded legal document he didn't immediately understand. He carried all three to the kitchen table and sat down and went through them in order. The photograph first. It showed the same two young women as the photograph from the bedroom. But this one was different, closer, and the camera had caught them in an unguarded moment, looking at each other rather than at the lens. Something in the way they looked at each other made Elliot set the photograph down and take a breath. The letter next. It was dated June 14, 2019, 4 years before Constance's death. Connie, it began. I'm not going to have another chance to say this properly, so I'm going to say it in a letter the way we used to, before everything went the way it went. You protected me when I couldn't protect myself. You took the blame for something that wasn't yours to take. You kept my name out of it, and you kept my daughter out of it, and I have lived for 30 years knowing that, and not being able to say it where anyone could hear me. If there is any way to set things right after I'm gone, I believe you'll find it. You always were the one who knew where things were buried. All my love until the last of it. V. Elliot read it twice. Then the legal document. It took him a few minutes to understand what he was reading. It was a birth registration, Ontario, 1985. Mother, Victoria Ann Callahan. Father, not listed, and the child's name given and family at the bottom of the page. Elliot sat back in the chair. The child's name was David Marshall Callahan. David Marshall. DM. The initials his father had always said stood for David Mackenzie, for his grandfather. His father's name had been David Marsh. His father, who had been adopted in 1986 by the Marsh family of New Liskeard, whose original surname no one had ever been able to tell Elliot, because the records, his mother had said, had been sealed. Elliot sat in the kitchen of a dead woman's house in northern Ontario on a Tuesday morning in November and understood that Constance Bellaire had spent 30 years keeping a promise to his grandmother. He called Graham Doyle that afternoon. I need to know, he said, what you can tell me about the connection between Constance Bellaire and a woman named Victoria Callahan. A silence on the other end of the line. Mr. Marsh, Graham said carefully, I was instructed not to discuss certain matters unless the heir asked directly. I'm asking directly. Another pause. Victoria Callahan was Constance Bellaire's closest friend for over 40 years. Victoria passed away in December 2022, approximately 10 months before Constance. It was Victoria's to Constance, who then communicated it to us, that her biological grandson inherit the property. Constance agreed to hold the estate in trust until she herself died, at which point it would pass to you. My father was adopted, Elliot said. He never knew his mother. No, Graham said quietly. He didn't. Victoria made that decision in 1985 and spent the rest of her life, by her own account in correspondence we were given, not being sure if it was the right one. Elliot looked out the window at the north field, at the flat grey sky above the tree line. What happened? Why did she give him up? That, Graham said, is a longer story, but I think you'll find most of it in the house. Constance left more than the property, Mr. Marsh. She left a record. She spent the last years of her life making sure you'd have the whole truth, if you wanted it. He didn't call the number on the note. Instead, he went back to the barn. He understood now why someone didn't want him there. He understood what they were afraid he'd find, not because there was anything hidden in the barn itself, but because the barn was where Victoria had worked, in the years before everything fell apart. Theodore had told him that, the following morning, sitting at the kitchen table over coffee that neither of them drank while it was hot, the barn had been Victoria's project. She had come up to visit Constance every summer for years, and she had rebuilt those shelves with her own hands, and every jar on those shelves had been filled and labelled by her. She was proud of it, Theodore said. His voice had gone rough around the edges. She said it was the most useful thing she'd ever made with her hands. You knew her, Elliot said. Not a question. Theodore was quiet for a while. Outside, the first snow of the season was coming down, light and exploratory, not yet committing to anything. For a long time, he said finally. He didn't offer more than that, and Elliot didn't push. He was learning that there were things on this property that would tell themselves in their own time. The person who had left the note came back on the 9th night. This time Elliot was ready. He'd positioned himself in the sitting room, in the dark, after leaving the kitchen light on. He heard the back door. They had their own key, whoever they were, or they'd found one, and the careful footsteps, and this time he stepped into the kitchen doorway and turned on the light. The man who spun around was perhaps 55, well dressed for someone who had just let himself into someone else's house at midnight, with the polished, slightly aggressive look of a person who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through money or pressure, and was not happy to find that neither was available at this particular moment. Miles Renwick, the man said, recovering faster than Elliot would have. I own the property adjacent to the North Field. I've been trying to negotiate a purchase. At midnight, Elliot said, with a key. Miles Renwick had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable, but only briefly. I had an arrangement with Constance. I was hoping we could come to a similar arrangement. The $250,000. That's a fair offer. More than fair, given the condition of the structures. What's in the North Field? Elliot asked. Something shifted behind Miles Renwick's eyes. Just a flicker, but Elliot had been watching for it. What do you mean? You want the land, specifically the north end of it. So I'm asking, what's there? Miles looked at him for a long moment, recalibrating. When he spoke again, the reasonable businessman manner had thinned somewhat, showing something older and less pleasant underneath. There's nothing there of any particular note, he said evenly. I want the land because it adjoins mine and I want to consolidate. That's all. I think, Elliot said, that you should leave. And I think you should know that I've already been in contact with the law firm handling the estate, and they're aware of your offer and how it was delivered. He did not say goodbye. Elliot called Graham again the next morning. Miles Renwick, he said. What do you know about him? A pause that was half a second too long. He's approached the estate before. Several times in the last 2 years of Constance's life, she refused every time. Why does he want the Northfield specifically? That, Graham said, I think you should ask Theodore. Theodore walked him out to the Northfield that afternoon, through 4 centimeters of new snow. The field itself looked like nothing. Flat ground, dormant grass, a row of old fence posts along the property line. But Theodore walked him to the center of it and stopped. What do you know about the cobalt silver rush? Theodore asked. Elliot looked at him. 1900s around there. The tailings from those mines went everywhere. Some of it got covered over, forgotten. Some of it ended up on private land. Theodore looked down at the snow-covered ground. Constance had this field surveyed in 2018. She never told anyone what they found. Elliot stared at the field. How valuable. Theodore shrugged, in the particular way of a Northern Ontario man who knew the answer to a question and was choosing not to quantify it. Enough that someone with the right equipment and the right permits would be interested. Enough that someone who knew about it might be willing to let himself into a stranger's house in the middle of the night. Elliot stood in the cold field for a long time. He thought about his grandmother, who had made jars of preserves in a barn 50 meters away, and who had never been able to tell his father who she was. He thought about Constance Bellaire, who had kept a promise across 30 years and set up the paperwork and stacked the firewood and left a note about the flu. He thought about what it meant that both of them had chosen to leave this to him. Not the silver, maybe, but the choice. The decision about what this land was worth, and to whom and why. She knew, Elliot said. Constance knew about the survey results. Yes, Theodore said. And she still left it to me, instead of selling it to Renwick. Yes, Theodore said again, because Victoria asked her to. Theodore looked at him then for the first time that afternoon. His eyes were old and clear, and held something that Elliot recognized after a moment, as the particular grief of a person who has outlived the people they loved best. Victoria said, Theodore began, and then stopped and swallowed and tried again. She said her son deserved to know where he came from, that she didn't have the courage to find him while she was alive, but that she could give you, something real, something she'd built, something that would last. The snow was coming down again, and then at the old man standing beside him in the cold, and then back at the land that was, impossibly, his. She made the jars in the barn, Elliot said, the labeled ones, every summer for 12 years. Theodore said. Elliot nodded. He couldn't say anything else right then, so he didn't try. He stayed for the 30 days. Then he stayed longer. In February he had a proper survey done, and got the numbers in writing, and called Graham to start the process of filing what needed to be filed. And he called a contractor friend from his old life in Sudbury to come look at what it would take to restore the farmhouse properly. He called his sister and had the first real conversation they'd had in 2 years. He did not call Miles Renwick. The brass compass sat on the kitchen windowsill, where the morning light came through and caught the cracked lens and broke it into small, moving pieces on the wall. In March, going through the last box in the study, the one he'd kept putting off because he wasn't sure he was ready for what might be in it, he found a second letter. This one addressed to David, in Victoria's handwriting, and sealed. His father had been dead for 6 years. Heart attack, sudden, at 61, before any of this could reach him, before Constance could follow through, or before Victoria had found the courage to try. Elliot held the letter for a long time. He didn't open it. That felt like something that was not his to open, even now, even after everything. He put it back in the box. He thought about what he'd do with the field, in the end. He thought about what Victoria had built with her hands in that barn, the careful labels on every jar, the 12 summers she'd spent being useful in the only way she knew how to be useful to a son who didn't know she existed. He thought you could spend a lifetime protecting a secret and still find a way, in the end, to pass the truth forward. What would you have done if someone had offered you $250,000 to walk away from a place you'd never been, from people you'd never met? Would you have taken it? Or would you have stayed long enough to find out who you were before the choice had been made for you? Elliot stayed. And because he stayed, he learned that his grandmother had spent 12 summers making preserves in a barn in northern Ontario, and that a woman named Constance Bellaire had kept a promise for 30 years without ever being asked to keep it, and that the most valuable thing on 52 acres of Canadian shield land turned out not to be the silver under the North Field. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're new here, there's plenty more where this came from. Subscribe to claim the drama, and we'll see you in the next one.